I recently went back and replayed the beginner's guide, and at the end of it there's this scene where you rise up into the sky and are surrounded by an endless maze. This kind of reminded me of a city, and it got me wondering if I could create a procedural scene full of different sized buildings and lights, the kind of thing that wouldn't require much detail but rather would look great as a scene viewed from a distance. I started by creating a building class, and in this generate building method I wrote some comments in the hope that they'd magically turn into code. When that didn't happen, I begrudgingly wrote a simple function that would get a random colour, height, width and number of windows for the building, before iterating up through that height value and randomly placing the assigned window prefab. I also wrote some more comments to outline what I wanted to achieve after I got this initial test working. I ended up scaling the test back here just to generate the building shapes. I also forgot I had the inspector on my other monitor at this point, so you can't see everything I'm doing here. Having to restart the game each time I wanted a new building was getting tedious, so I made it so I could press enter to generate a new building. With this working, I started on creating the window prefab and the emissive materials. I originally tried using a transparent glass material with an emissive one behind it. But this had a bunch of issues, so I just settled on a plain emissive material instead. I realised that my buildings would need to have windows on multiple sides, so I came up with a system to randomly distribute them on 3 sides of the building. I started by just implementing the front window spawning. I had some trouble getting this to behave, but my issues mostly boiled down to me instantiating it in the wrong coordinate space. Here is where I started adding the left and right sides of the window spawning. It took some fiddling, but eventually I started getting somewhere. I decided to do a quick test and duplicate the buildings a bunch for a preview of how the finished product would look. I felt the buildings were working well enough for me to move on to the city builder script, which will take these buildings and place them in a grid so to resemble a city. I was planning on making things much more complex with a 2D array and cells with the concept of traversal, but I decided to scale things back and just have a nested for loop that, depending on a random value, will place buildings at that position. This worked great, but I'd overlooked an issue with the building lights, where I wasn't basing their position on the position of the building, which led to them all being stuck in the same place. After fixing this, I was really starting to make progress. I continued to polish the city generator and expose some variables to make adjustments easier. At this stage I felt like adding something to admire the view from, like an apartment. I am very much a hobbyist modeller, so don't expect anything incredible, I just slapped this together in an hour or so. I then brought the model into Unity and started setting up the materials and lighting. With the apartment working, I could address a major issue I'd noticed: performance. I had so many instances of game objects and lights that even a small city would cause frame rates to chug. I discovered Unity has a method where you can pass it an array of matrices, which represent the transformations we want in 3D space, a material, and then a mesh to draw at these transforms. Where we don't have to instantiate objects and are just drawing the same instance mesh, we can save a huge amount of performance. I had an idea to make the lights on the buildings randomly turn on and off to simulate how it would be in real life. And the approach I had in mind was to simply take certain entries out of the array of window positions that I was passing into the render mesh function. Iterating through this array to construct a new one for each building is very taxing, so I put it in a burst job. For the uninitiated, burst jobs allow for highly optimized code, as whatever you write gets compiled down to native code, and you can even go and view generated assembly in the editor. There are some restrictions that come with burst jobs, but for long iterations or expensive tasks they are an incredibly powerful tool, and using them has paid off, as I was able to implement my idea with no noticeable performance loss. I wanted to apply some post-processing effects, so I really got the scene looking its best, and one of the most impactful ones I applied was global illumination, which essentially illuminates surrounding objects based on nearby lights. Unfortunately, enabling this would cause me some issues later on, so I'll be coming back to this. At this point in the project, I ended up taking a bit of a detour. I thought it would be cool to have the TV in the apartment be functional, and my intention was to make a simple YouTube player that could be controlled in-game. Getting a video to play was easy, as I could just use Unity's built-in video player, so naturally I did the necessary testing before starting work on the YouTube integration. It quickly dawned on me that making something like this myself was outside the scope of this project, so I found an existing Unity add-on called Unity YouTube Player, which works alongside another project called YouTube DL, and created my own wrapper and UI to allow for inputting of a URL into the player via the in-game TV. At this stage I was feeling pretty happy with the project, so I thought it would be a good time to push it to its limits and see what kind of results I could get. So I increased the limits on the size of the city I could generate and took some footage of me panning around the scene. Global illumination really helps give the buildings definition, so you'll see why I was hesitant to remove it when I get to that issue I mentioned later on. When I created a TV interface, I put in a way to test it by pressing certain keys on the keyboard, but I wanted to have a more interactive way of using it, such as having to pick up the remote in the game. This required me to add an interaction system, so I kind of cheated and took one I'd already made for another game and brought it into this one. It uses a custom path and a shader to overlay an outline on objects in a certain layer. So when I look at an object that implements the selectable interface I created, I simply have to swap its layer over to get the outline to show up. I had to modify it somewhat, as I originally designed it for situations where the item would only be held for as long as the mouse button is being held, whereas here I wanted to be able to just click once to pick something up, so I had to add an option that, when enabled, would check if the player is holding something, and then if so, would drop it when right click was pressed. I also had to account for my lazy modelling, and add an option for setting the rotation an object would have when picked up, as some of my models had weird rotations that had to be accounted for. Now I could get to work on improving the TV UI. I added a button to the video player to make it clear that you could go back to the search screen from the video player, and then I made it so the TV can only be controlled while holding the remote. Now my focus was on lighting the apartment. I wanted to bake the lights for improved quality, but for some reason the baked lighting wasn't showing up at all. It took me some time to narrow down the problem, but I eventually found it was the screen space global illumination I'd enabled earlier that was causing the problem. Removing global illumination entirely would be a huge hit to the look of the scene, so I went searching for a solution where I could have both working at the same time. I came across light probe proxy volumes, which will automatically place light probes over a mesh and can be configured to act in a variety of ways. After much trial and error, I set mine up to update only when a city is generated, but to do so using the highest quality possible. I had issues with the illumination looking underwhelming, but this was mostly due to the apartment facing to the one side of the building that I didn't bother to place the lights on. All I had to do now was add a way to sit down and watch TV, which due to this being at the end of the project was a bit of a hack. Where the system I created for interacting with items only listens and calls the on right click method of an item when that item is being held by the player, I had to child the sofa to the player when they go to sit on it, so when they right click it will call that and go back to the player camera. I also had to block the remote from receiving inputs while interacting with the sofa, as that was causing issues. This brings us to the end of the project. I think the city turned out great, and I plan to use the generation in other games as an easy backdrop, but let me know what you think in the comments.